Turkish Airlines presents Business Africa.
Hello and welcome to Business Africa with me, Ronald Kato. This week, a landmark policy by the European Union to whip polluting exporters into line could cut $25 billion of Africa's GDP per year, but its consequences will be felt mostly by countries emitting the least and also the poorest. Also coming up, Uganda is considering a tax waiver on imported electric vehicles. The goal is to reduce pollution and to improve Kampala's green credentials, but infrastructure shortcomings stand in the way. Also, East Africa was the only region to record growth in foreign direct investment in 2022, even as turbulence rattled the global economy. The region's best performers were South Sudan and Kenya. Stay with us for the details. Thank you for joining us. The Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, aims to stop goods whose production led to the emission of greenhouse gases from reaching the EU market. If they do, they are hit with a levy. But the measure will reduce Africa's GDP by $25 billion per year, the equivalent of wiping out the entire economies of Liberia, Sierra Leone, Comoros, Burundi, the Central African Republic, and the Gambia combined. The CBAM will hurt the competitiveness of African exports and put thousands of jobs on the line.
The Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, is the European Union's measure to encourage countries where it sources imports to adopt cleaner manufacturing and to cut greenhouse gas emissions. But the measure has elicited concern in Africa, which counts the EU as a major export market. A study carried out by the Africa Climate Foundation and the London School of Economics suggests that the CBAM's economic repercussions will be far-reaching and most strongly felt in Africa. According to their modeling, the CBAM will reduce African GDP by $25 billion per year. Products such as iron and steel, cement, aluminium, fertilizer, hydrogen, and electricity will make up a significant portion of African exports to Europe, and an important source of jobs are the primary target of the mechanism. After 2026, the CBAM scope will extend to other products, resulting in even further damage. Observers say the measure is punitive and dramatically reduces the space for developing countries to achieve growth and to create jobs.
Faten Agad is a senior advisor on climate diplomacy and geopolitics at the African Climate Foundation. Thank you very much, Faten, for your time. The CBAM takes effect in October, at least the transitional phase. How do you assess the readiness of African countries?
As you know, our countries, we have an issue in terms of energy access. And so transitioning, all these sectors will be difficult. But importantly, is that the investments in Africa to finance this green transition have been lagging behind. We receive a total of 2% of investments globally. And add to that the fact that the developed countries, including, those introducing these measures, have not met their climate finance targets and promises for developing countries. Perhaps an additional point also on our readiness is that what the CBAM requires is a very thorough, detailed emission reporting system. With the exception of South Africa, and even then it's not a system that's really working well. But for most of the continent, we do not have those systems into place. So it becomes extremely difficult for an African exporter to prove, for instance, that they are using 100% green energy or X percentage of green energy in their production.
And how has Africa responded, Faten? Has there been any sort of engagement between the EU and the AU on the CBAM?
Yeah, certainly a number of countries have raised the issue. It's actually been raised at different levels. It's been raised at the level of Brussels directly with the European Commission. I know that some of the countries have mobilized their embassies essentially in several European countries to try and convince the European partners to kind of help on this. But these kind of measures such as the CBAM, which are trade related, are what's called the exclusive competency of the European Commission. What that means is that European individual countries have a limited say into what Brussels does. And Brussels doesn't seem open to open a discussion on the CBAM.
Faten, what would be the best way, the fairest way to apply the CBAM to Africa, considering it is not a major polluter, and the fact that it has unique development challenges?
Now, if one takes the LDCs, the least developed countries, most of them being in Africa, the emission reduction effect of the CBAM would be a mere 0.0007%. The point here is not climate, because imposing such measures on Africa would not result in any significant climate gains. What the EU can do, and I think that can be a positive agenda for both Europe and Africa, is to support the transition of some of these sectors in Africa. Let me take the steel industry, for instance, where the EU is currently engaged in almost a trade war with the US. And yet I think Europe can look a bit closer to its geography. By developing the transition of this industrial base in Africa and bringing production closer to the energy sources which are in Africa, Europe would essentially serve a double agenda of one, providing a positive response and a positive help to support African countries to respond to the CBAM, while also serving a European agenda of securing its own supply chain of things such as green steel, green aluminium, etc., which is important, by the way, for the car industry in Europe as well. So I do feel that we need to think a bit more with the logic of enabling a new partnership with Africa rather than these punitive measures such as the CBAM.
Faten Agad, nice to have you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Uganda is racing to switch to e-mobility despite having limited infrastructure. This follows an announcement by the government to waive taxes on electric vehicles entering the country. Isabel Nakidia reports.
Uganda is plugging into e-mobility, joining the race to a clean means of transport. This is one of the few commercial charging points in Kampala where electric car owners can power their engines. The vehicles are also designed with home charging kits for convenience.
It comes with two ports. What you have, the first port you have here, the big port here, is the commercial charging, which is basically the rapid. The small orange one there is the home charging. The vehicle comes with a home kit.
Despite the convenience of in-home charging, very few Ugandans own electric vehicles because they are still unaffordable to the average person, but require lower maintenance costs. Fossil-powered vehicles are more popular yet emit carbon into the atmosphere, affecting climate change.
You'll find that the cost of ownership is lower because of the low maintenance that you have on the vehicle.
Uganda is considering a zero tax on electric vehicles to gradually adopt green mobility. Uganda also owns a locally made electric vehicle assembling plant that experts argue need government support for the industry to grow. Currently, Kira Motors owns 4 electric buses which can go up to 300 kilometers on a single charge.
We need to be supporting industries like Kira who are creating buses and public transport, because we will never be able to curb our emissions just through vehicle usage.
Globally, road transport is responsible for nearly 15% of emissions, and completely phasing out fossil fuel vehicles will help countries prevent temperatures from rising by 1.5 degrees in the next decade.
Now, East African countries defied economic turbulence in 2022 to post a 17% growth in foreign direct investment, with South Sudan and Kenya seeing the highest percentage increases. On the contrary, inflows dived in southern, western and central Africa.
According to the latest statistics from the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, foreign investment into East Africa proved resilient despite economic woes, rising from $4.9 billion in 2021 to $5.8 billion in 2022. South Sudan posted the largest increase in FDI inflows, which rose 80% to $121 million, nearly double the $67.5 million it received in 2021. Kenya saw the second largest growth in inflows, which rose 64% to $759 million from $463 million a year earlier. The Democratic Republic of Congo is East Africa's leading investment destination. The worst affected region was Southern Africa, where investment inflows dropped sixfold to $7 billion in 2022. While the Central and West African regions posted a decline of 7% and 35% respectively. The report says turbulence in the global economy continues to hold back investor confidence.
And that wraps up this episode of Business Africa. I am Ronald Kato. The news continues on air and online. Bye for now, and I'll see you on the next episode of Business Africa.
Business Africa was presented by Turkish Airlines.